Welcome to the Does It Work podcast by Biomarker Labs, where you can find wellness without the woo.
There's an alligator coming down.
Awesome. Today I'm joined by Dr. Kristen Knutson. She's an anthropologist and sleep and circadian rhythm researcher and associate professor of neurology, specifically sleep medicine and preventive medicine at Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences. And super excited to have you on. You've got some really fascinating research on sleep and circadian rhythms.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So the most kind of interesting, or the question I am most interested in, I'll just kind of begin with. I was curious about your research into whether sleep and circadian rhythms partially mediate socioeconomic and or racial ethnic health disparities. That's a lot in that sentence that I got from one of your abstracts. So yeah, can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to try. Work from my group as well as others have shown that inadequate sleep, so whether that's short sleep or poor sleep quality or the presence of a sleep disorder, this inadequate sleep is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease or metabolic diseases like diabetes. So that's part one. Part two, we have also seen that people of lower socioeconomic status, whether that's lower income or lower education, or racial and ethnic minorities, particularly African Americans, also are more likely to have inadequate sleep. And it's been well recognized for quite some time that these same groups, lower socioeconomic status and racial and ethnic minorities, are also more likely to have cardiovascular and metabolic disease. So my question is whether or not, or to what degree, does poor sleep play in racial and ethnic or socioeconomic health disparities?
Yeah, and so what is the connection between lower SES and lack of sleep? What kind of causes that, or is it?
Well, there's probably, so the reasons why lower socioeconomic status or minorities might have worse sleep could be a variety of reasons. One of the more obvious ones is just lack of time. Like if you're working multiple jobs, if you also on top of that have children that you need to take care of, there's just a limited amount of time that's going to be available to be in bed. Then that could be compounded by, I think, a major factor is going to be stress. Stress, not surprisingly, is terrible for sleep. And people from lower socioeconomic status may experience a greater burden of stress over their lifetime. It could be related to the neighborhood they live in. If it's noisier, for example, that's going to disturb your sleep. So there's a lot of possible sources of factors that would disturb sleep that could be experienced more often by people from lower SES or racial and ethnic minorities. And I think that's the question we need to be asking, is why is sleep worse? And more importantly, what can we do about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so how does circadian rhythms kind of play into these sleep challenges?
Well, so our ability to sleep, as I'm sure you've experienced, is somewhat dictated by our internal biological clock. So we can't fall asleep at any time of day. And anyone who's traveled across time zones has experienced jet lag. And this is what jet lag is that we're trying to do things at the wrong time of day for our body. And so if somebody's working shift work, for example, it's very hard to get a good night's sleep when it's actually during the daytime. If you're jumping around the clock because of variability in your schedule, that's going to make it harder to sleep because of some disruption in your biological clock or your circadian rhythms. And so the circadian system plays a really important role in how well one can sleep and when one sleeps. And so that's on top of just sleep in general, looking at the timing of behaviors and how they might affect the ability to get a good night's sleep.
And this is a big question, but what are your thoughts on the causal relationship between lack of sleep and other diseases? I saw you wrote a paper about the connection between the two, but there's kind of the age-old question, same with obesity, like, do these other conditions cause a lack of sleep, or is the lack of sleep causing the other conditions?
Yeah, and I think it's probably both, but we have two types of evidence for associations between sleep and chronic disease, for example. One set is one of the studies like I do that are observational studies where we try to figure out how much or how well someone sleeps on a day-to-day basis in the real world and look at the association with either the existence of health problems in chronic disease or the future development of chronic disease. Other evidence comes from experimental studies where you take healthy people and you disturb their sleep or don't let them get enough sleep and see what physiological changes occur as a result of that. And those are stronger studies in a sense because they're controlled experiments in the laboratory. And you do see a lot of negative effects of insufficient sleep on the body. So one study, a week of 4 hours in bed was associated with really impaired glucose metabolism or impaired ability to process sugar in the blood. But those studies, as you can imagine, are just short-term by necessity, and things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes develop over a longer term. But the two pieces together seem to suggest there is an association. And I think the next thing, again, we really want to do is figure out how can we improve sleep and does that have beneficial effects for individuals?
Absolutely. Tell me more about the impact of sleep deprivation on blood glucose, because that's something that I know insulin is something that a lot of people like biohackers and people who are focused on longevity are really focused on right now.
Oh, okay, you say so. Right, so the study I was referring to, so this is an older study that took lean, healthy young men, like in their 20s, only let them sleep for 4 hours in bed a night for a week, and compared that to a week of about 10 or 12 hours in bed. And the effect on a measurement called glucose tolerance was not only statistically significant, the effect was clinically significant. So the value for these young men, when after they had plenty of sleep, was what you would expect for young healthy men. It was in the range for healthy adults. But the week of sleep restriction put this value, this average glucose tolerance, into a range associated with older, 60s and older adults with impaired glucose tolerance. So it was a really big change after only a week.
And just remind us what glucose tolerance means.
Glucose tolerance is it's the ability to, when you ingest glucose, or to ability to get the blood glucose out of your blood and into your tissues where it needs it.
So if it's hanging out and it's not in your tissues, then it's kind of wreaking havoc on your organs.
Right, and it suggests there might be insulin resistance, and that's why it's not being taken up by muscle, for example, if your insulin isn't working properly. But there are other sites, like the brain, for example, that doesn't require insulin for the tissues to take up glucose. So it could reflect that the brain is just not taking up as much glucose when you're sleep deprived as when you're fully rested.
That makes sense. I was also curious about, you found that some aspects of industrialization are beneficial to sleep. Looking at some, I believe, African communities comparing pre-industrialization and like kind of going through industrialization. Is that right?
Are you talking about the Mozambique study?
Yes.
Probably, yeah. Yeah, so in that study, there were, my colleagues had collected some sleep data in sort of the same region of the country, but in one group was living in a more urban area, town area, and the other group was living a more traditional lifestyle in a more rural area. Now, I just want to caution that when I say urban, I'm not talking like, don't picture New York City or Chicago. This is more of a town, small town with some access to electrification and other aspects. And there was, I think, as we transition from more rural traditional lifestyles, there's a lot of changes that can occur, including access to electricity, as well as changes in occupation, changes in diet. So there's a lot of factors that may be good for sleep and a lot of factors that may not be, such as light. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious because I generally hear, like you mentioned earlier, the noise and the light pollution, for example, of cities. I've never really heard that cities could be good for sleep. I'm a big urbanist, so I'm always looking for, defenses of cities. So.
Well, I think in the Mozambique study, what's different and why I caution not to picture, say, Chicago or New York, is that although they have electricity, it's not on 24/7 like it is in our cities now because it's expensive. So they have access to light, but it's typically a dimmer light, and they don't, run it all the time like we tend to here. So I think it's, it's a progression. It's not one day you're rural and the next day the town is going to look like New York. So I think there's a lot of different factors that are changing as towns become bigger and more urban.
Yeah. So like some aspects of industrialization that might be beneficial for sleep. I think you mentioned like more comfortable beds. Were you also thinking like the ability to control the ambient temperature of your bedroom?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
That's a big one for sleep. To
Yeah.
not be too hot or too cold, as much as one can control that, is going to be beneficial for sleep.
Yeah.
If you can control noise, so if you're living in a building that has thick walls and windows that can block out some of the noise, whatever noise there may be, that's going to be helpful for sleep. If you're going to be able to keep your bedroom as dark as possible, that's going to be good as well.
Yeah. So since you're someone who focuses on circadian rhythms, I wanted to ask you this question about room temperature and sleep. There was one study that you're probably familiar with of hunter-gatherer societies that looked at when they went to sleep and when they woke up, and it turns out that they assumed that they would go to sleep and wake up with the sun light, but it actually turned out that they went to sleep when the temperature dropped, and got up when the temperature started getting warmer, which indicates that sleep your circadian rhythm may be more driven by temperature than light even. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in terms of sleep, we know from previous work that, our internal biological rhythm of our internal body temperature, that sleep onset is closely linked to when our body temperature is declining. In modern United States, our internal body temperature rhythm and our controlling of the external temperature, they're somewhat separate to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
But in hunter-gatherer communities, the external temperature and your internal temperature, you don't have control over the external temperature, so they're probably more closely linked to one another. And so sleep is, we've known for a while that sleep and sleep onset is very closely linked to this temperature rhythm, and when body temperature is going down, it's much easier to fall asleep. Our synchronization of our internal clock to the external world is still the strongest signal for us is going to be the light dark cycle.
Okay. And so what, like, as far as temperature goes, do you recommend people turn their thermostats down? Is there an ideal sleeping temperature?
Oh, I've heard that somewhere around 67 degrees is best for sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I put my thermostat.
Yeah. And do you use any special lighting in your house?
I have blackout curtains, so
Okay.
I try to keep the street lights out. But yeah.
Yeah, I bought some from Amazon and they're white, and I should have known they would not be very useful, and they're not. So
they have to be thick and probably dark. And
yeah, I need to buy some more, but I love them.
It's a start.
Yeah, so another thing that I was really surprised by is there seemed to be, again from reading one of your abstracts, an association between poor sleep quality and intense physical labor, which, really surprised me because we've seen a lot of evidence that exercise improves sleep, though not immediately. It takes a few months to kick in. And, just, all kinds of benefits from physical labor. Like, for example, I was reading, I believe it was the Congo was having, obesity problems for the first time because people were moving away from, very demanding physical labor and into more clerical work. Yeah. So what is the correlation?
Yeah, we think is happening there because when I saw those findings as well, I was a little surprised because I had heard too that physical exercise is good for sleep and a lot of other things as well. And so when there was a study in the Amazon with the rubber tappers, and they had really the individuals who had the very physically demanding jobs had worse sleep quality. But what is a possible explanation for that is this is physical activity to the point of extreme muscle soreness, not just physical exercise, because it's very demanding. And from what I understand is the participants complained about, essentially being in pain, and we know pain is bad for sleep quality. So if you're exercising to the point of pain, then that's not going to be good for you for a lot of reasons, but it's not going to be good for sleep.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah, and so another thing that really got me less than delighted was to read that being a night owl might be correlated with some suboptimal outcomes.
Yeah. We got a lot of attention for that, and from a lot of night owls. Apparently a lot of journalists are night owls. So in that study we found that individuals, so this was a large study where people just asked, do you consider yourself like definite morning person, definite night person, or somewhere in between? And so the night owls would be those who said that they felt they were definitely an evening type. And then the studies following them, they had a lot of health measures, and they followed them over time, tracking death records. And we found that the definite evening types were 10% more likely to die over this 6.5-year period than the definite morning types were, even after we took into account sort of baseline health conditions and so forth. And I think that's probably due to a lot of things, but one concern is that people who are definite night owls, it might be that because of their job or other lifestyle factors, they're trying to live in a morning person world. And it's more the disconnect or desynchrony between their internal body clock and their social life and what they have to do and when they have to wake up. So we don't think it's necessarily anything inherent to being a night owl, but more sort of the struggle between their internal clock and the external world they're trying to live in that might cause health problems in the long run.
And this is probably a really stupid question, but so the night owls in the morning, people are sleeping the same amount and getting the same quality sleep?
Well, we only had a measure, yes, they reported sleeping the same amount. So we took into account sleep duration.
Okay.
Sleep quality may have been different. We didn't have a measure of sleep quality other than having trouble falling or staying asleep, but there may still be some underlying sleep quality differences that could partially explain some of these health differences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it will be interesting to see how, changes in work, especially in like the, industrialized nations, the move toward, thinky work, the move toward work that can be done remotely and asynchronously will help people who are more evening oriented. Like, for example, on one of our other episodes, we have a woman who runs a startup and, starts at 11 because she finds her employees are more creative types and tend to be more evening types. So do you have any other recommendations for ways that, schools and employers and other, government agencies can help to mitigate some of this?
Right. I think I think you already pointed out that our society is already moving towards a more flexible work schedule. In a sense, we're not all strictly 9 to 5 and then everything closes at 5 p.m. And I think that will help eventually, as for those individuals that have the opportunity to work in industries where there is more flexible schedules, that's going to benefit them. And we've also sort of made the point to the employers that if a flexible schedule is within the realm of possibility, it would benefit them as well, because they're, you schedule the morning people in the morning shifts and the evening people in the evening shifts, you're going to have, better productivity, better morale, better working environment if people are working at the times that are best for them. So I think that as much as possible, just to be aware that there are individual differences in the time of day at which people are going to be at their best, then trying to figure out who those people are and schedule accordingly will be beneficial for both sides, both the employer and the employee. But I think it'll take a bigger shift in society to make bigger changes than that. But baby steps. Let people know that this is important for their health, but also there may be strategies to take advantage of the fact that people vary.
Absolutely. And I also wanted to ask you, and this is maybe outside of your things that you've thought about or studied, but I'm really interested in intermittent fasting and its impact on things like circadian rhythms and sleep. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know much about intermittent fasting, but with respect to circadian rhythms, we talked about circadian rhythms and sleep, but one area we're also interested in is food intake and how it might impact our circadian rhythms, because there's body clocks, not just in our brain, there are little clocks throughout most of our body and tissues. And one signal to the tissues clocks is food intake. And so when someone eats might also be important for health. And I know there's a lot of people really trying to test this and figure out, are there optimal diet strategies of when to eat and how to structure your meals across the day. And I think it's a really interesting area, and circadian rhythms are going to play a role in that.
Certainly. And how do you feel about polyphasic sleep?
Do you mean like bimodal sleep?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing that's unique about humans is, and the hunter-gatherer data shows this, is that we are pretty flexible with when and how we sleep. If we need to be up, we can wake ourselves up, even if we're a little sleep deprived. And I think that it's going to be next to impossible to figure out what is the natural human way to sleep. Naps there's a circadian dip in the afternoon that suggests napping may be a biologically natural phenomenon, but the extended period at night that we require for bimodal sleep at night, where you sleep for 4 hours, awake for a little bit, and sleep some more, that's going to require special circumstances that allows you to have that much time to be laid in bed. And so I just don't think we're going to see it in many communities today. And I think just the plasticity, how flexible humans are with respect to when and how we sleep, I think is one of the advantages we've had as a species.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that more and more, that there are few hard and fast rules when it comes to human health. It's kind of people respond differently to different interventions.
The environment is so different, has changed so much in such a short period of time for humans, and then across the globe it's incredibly different. And to look at just sleep in isolation is not the best way. We have to take into account the context and the environment individuals are living in.
Sure, absolutely. So besides keeping your room cool and keeping it dark and trying to keep a schedule, what are some things that people should do to take good care of their circadian rhythms?
Again, I'd repeat the keeping a regular schedule as much as possible. And then staring at your smartphone or your tablet at night, that actually suppresses melatonin, a hormone that's helpful for sleep and circadian rhythms. It has been shown to impair sleep. And things like alcohol and caffeine, a lot of people will tell me that doesn't bother them, but then they'll also complain about not sleeping well. So just to pay attention to what you're eating and drinking, especially shortly before bed, is a way to sort of keep track of your sleep and aim for better sleep hygiene.
Absolutely. And what are your thoughts on the commercially available sleep trackers on the market?
Well, they could be good and bad. They're good if they make people more aware of their sleep patterns and therefore pay attention to if they're not spending enough time in bed and trying to get more sleep. So I think that's a good, just like a food diary gets you to pay more attention to what you're eating. However, if the sleep tracker is causing anxiety because you're not sleeping well enough, that could only exacerbate any sleep problems. So I think it's a balance. It's good to have to sort of keep track, but don't let it drive you to an anxiety. If you have any concerns, I'd raise it with a physician, but I don't want people to start to panic if their watch is telling them they're not sleeping very well.
Yeah. Well, and if anything, your watch is probably overestimating your sleep.
That's what they say.
And before I let you go, I just wanted to ask you if there were any sleep myths you like to debunk. Common misconceptions.
Well, one is that we don't think sleep need declines with older people. It might just be they're not able to obtain as much sleep. I think another myth too, here's the one that drives me nuts, is we were grown up thinking that a healthy sleep should be you fall asleep and you stay sound asleep for 8 hours straight and then you wake up. We know that it's natural to wake up throughout the night, and some people don't realize that. And so if they wake up in the middle of the night, and if they're particularly anxious about it, that may cause concern, and then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that leads them to developing insomnia. Waking up occasionally during the night is not a sign of a sleep disorder. And so if you do wake up, just don't worry about it, roll over and try to go back to sleep.
I did not know that. I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of heard that it was normal to wake up, but it's good to like get that in black and white, that it's.
I mean, if you wake up and you really can't fall back to sleep, I mean, that may be an issue, but if just waking up and seeing the window or seeing your clock, don't automatically jump to there's a sleep problem.
absolutely. And like you said, the anxiety will only exacerbate it.
Yeah, exactly. Then we'll have a sleep problem.
I've been on the, but I'm also interested in because I've been reading over and over again that sleep need declines as you get older, and you're saying that's a myth.
We think it's not true. With sleep ability might decline as we get older. I mean, older, I'm talking about adults. Kids need more sleep than adults.
Right.
Okay. I'm talking about from, say, your 30s through to your 70s or older, that sleep need shouldn't decline by much, and it may just be comorbidities or other health problems that's leading to an inability to obtain as much sleep as people got when they were younger.
Sure.
We also see that your biological clock things start to happen earlier. So you start to get sleepy earlier in the day. And so older people might force themselves to stay awake longer so that they're up with their families, and then they end up getting less sleep. So yeah, so that's a sleep myth, is that we think is a sleep myth, that people as they age don't necessarily need less sleep. They may just not be able to get as much sleep.
That makes sense. All right. Is there anything else you'd want our listeners to know about sleep?
No, I mean, it's great that that you're doing these types of stories, that we get the message out there that sleep is an important part of healthy lifestyle, along with diet and exercise, and that the three together should be considered as part of a healthy lifestyle and not just in isolation from one another. Yeah,
absolutely. And I really appreciate, hardcore researchers taking the time to kind of break it down for the laymen and women.
We try.
Thank you so much for coming on.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Does It Work podcast by Biomarker Labs. For links, show notes, and more, check out biomarker.io/podcast.